Welcome everyone to our event on unhealthy perfectionism. My name is Anastasia. I'm co-chair of the Thriving from the Start Network and Wellbeing Lead at the Bank of England, and really thrilled to be moderating today's event. Hopefully lots of you are familiar with Thriving from the Start, but just in case you're not, very briefly, we are an early careers mental health network for people who are either in the first couple of years of their careers or maybe still in education and thinking about that transition into the workplace. And we want to create a sense of community around mental health, raise awareness around some of the challenges, and also make sure that organisations engage with best practice with regards to how they look after the mental health and well-being of their early careers populations. So before we dive into the event, just a couple of housekeeping things. So you'll all be automatically on mute. If you could keep yourselves that way, just so that we can make sure that the sound quality is great, so that we can hear our lovely panellists. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session, but feel free to send through questions in the chat as they come to you throughout the event, and then we'll have a look at them when we get to the Q&A section, and I will put them to our panellists. And the event is being recorded, so just so that you're aware, that means that we can share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it today, and also share it with you if you're interested in rewatching it at a later date. So hopefully you're all aware, but today we're talking about unhealthy perfectionism, which is a phenomenon that we're hearing more and more about. And to start our conversation on the topic today, I'm really delighted to welcome Farimah Darbyshire. Farimah is the Early Careers Mental Health Programme Lead at the City Mental Health Alliance, and she works with businesses to protect, support and create positive mental health for people who are making that transition out of education into their first jobs. And today, Farimah is going to share her insights into how we can actually define unhealthy perfectionism and what it looks like. So, Farimah, I'm going to hand over to you. Please do share a bit more about yourself if you'd like to, or if you're happy with my introduction, please do dive right into what unhealthy perfectionism actually is.
Thank you, Anastasia. That introduction was perfect. I don't think we need to talk about me anymore, and it's great to be here, and it's great to be a part of this really important conversation. So unhealthy perfectionism is not a term that people are necessarily familiar with. It is prevalent. It is impacting on people's mental health and well-being, and it is particularly prevalent at the start of people's career and at education as they're about to make that transition into the workplace. And I just wanted to talk briefly, we're going to hear from a few brilliant personal stories later on, but I want to talk briefly about what unhealthy perfectionism is and how it manifests itself in the workplace so that we can recognize it in ourselves. So if one is living with unhealthy perfectionism, a potential trait is setting unrealistically high expectations and standards for yourself. So these standards may just be about attainable, but it's significant negative consequence for your life. For example, working very late continuously to get everything absolutely perfect. Quick to find fault in your work, overly self-critical, and you can dwell on small mistakes ages after they've happened, even if 90% of what else you've done has been really good. We may procrastinate a project or a task which we're scared at not doing well at, to the point it becomes even more stressful. And we can perceive developmental feedback from colleagues and managers as criticism and a sign that we are failing. And there is little or no celebration of good work. It's kind of on to the next thing. What's the next thing that I've got to do? And I just want to pause there and see if anyone recognizes any of those behaviors in themselves. I mean, I'll put my hand up. When I'm writing these kind of things out, I do procrastinate a project if I'm worried I'm not going to do well in it, or do it easily, and that obviously doesn't make anything any better. And I also find mistake or dwell on small mistakes for ages afterwards. So it's just something to reflect on and recognize in of yourself. But what we're not suggesting is that striving to do well is something you shouldn't do. That is, of course, something that people should be doing. And if you want to strive for excellence, that's great. But there is a healthy way of doing it. And what does that look like? It's setting high but realistic standards for yourself and reaching for help when you need it to achieve those standards. It's those achievement of those goals come with some negative consequences. So you might miss out on a few nights out. I know there's not very many nights out at the minute, but you might miss out on some kind of social life or social activity, but it isn't a regular, enduring thing. And you can reflect on a process and take on board developmental feedback. and you're able to recognize success and celebrate when you've done things well. So if you compare unhealthy perfectionism in the workplace to exercise, there are healthy and good ways to lose weight, build muscle, get fit, train for running, but there are points at which it tips over into not being healthy for yourself. So I guess it's kind of learning to recognize when it's tipping over to that point and it is unhealthy. And a study of tens of thousands of people found that perfectionism among young people has significantly increased since the 1980s. So if you do recognize these traits, you are not alone in that. Lots of other people are feeling that way. It's not clear why. There can be lots of reasons: extra exams, pressure of social media, pressure to get the perfect job. But it is prevalent, and I think it's important to recognize it in ourselves and understand how it can impact us. I'm gonna hand back to Anastasia in a moment, but I do also want to say, while it is important to recognize it in yourself and think about how you can take a step back and manage it, and I'm sure we'll learn from a panel on how we can do that, I want to be very clear that we know that businesses and employers have a role to play in this. We know that there is external pressure on people at the start of their career and as they make that transition. And this is also on businesses and employers to make a change. And I am working, and the CMHA is working with members to do so, to create a growth culture rather than this perfectionist, everything has to be perfect culture. So there is work to do. And on that note, I'll hand back to you, Anastasia.
Thank you so much for that really, really interesting insight. And I think one of the messages that is definitely key for us, for all our audience members to take away, was really highlighted there, touching on those statistics, that there is an increase in this kind of perfectionism in the population that we're trying to address, that you're not alone. So if you've signed on to this event and you think this is something I really struggle with and it can feel very isolating in itself, I guarantee you there's plenty of people on the call, and including our panelists and myself, who absolutely resonate with what you're feeling. So hopefully that will be at least one thing to take away from today's event. So next up, I'm really delighted to hand over to our next panel member, Ashley Faith Fontaine. Ashley is the Head of Communications and Workplace Wellbeing at EM360 and a wonderful mental health advocate beyond her day job, sharing important messaging into the wider community. So Ashley, please do share a bit about yourself and your journey with unhealthy perfectionism.
Thank you, Anastasia. So yeah, I've been in the role that I'm in today for just about coming up to a year and a bit now. So yeah, it hasn't been long since I've come out of university at all. But yeah, it's definitely been a journey. So I can say that in terms of unhealthy perfectionism, it's something that I've battled with for a long time. But it became quite intense, I would say, when it came to A-level time. And then kind of moving through and still being on high alert throughout uni, and then kind of unraveling into work. But yeah, I've always had quite high expectations of myself. And I think like Farimah was saying about the tipping point, I think, yeah, that's for me where I put too much pressure on myself to exceed in like all aspects of life, to the point where it becomes very overwhelming. So yeah, in terms of A-levels, that pressure kind of built up because of the like everything must go right thought, everything must go as planned kind of thought, especially in terms of when it came to applying for unis. There was only one uni that I wanted to go to, and I did get into it, thankfully. But yeah, there was a lot of pressure at the time, and it wasn't pressure that I put, it was pressure that I put on myself, but it wasn't pressure from, I would say for me personally, it wasn't outside pressures. So I didn't really have any family pressures. It was just solely me. And that kind of, like I said, continued throughout university. So I think one example that I can give when it first started was when I got into my first year and I got my first. So I remember just kind of thinking, well, I've got my first, so why can't I get this again? And it just became a constant kind of uphill climb to constantly try and get that first. And if I didn't get it, I felt like a failure. And I remember staying up late once, which I wouldn't usually do until I came to university. It was staying up late for this one report that I had to do. It was a placement report. I'd never done a placement report before, but I kept going over and over it because I wanted it to be perfect. And yeah, so life kind of became that constant kind of ticking off a report card and of accomplishments. And kind of linking those accomplishments back to my self-worth. And yeah, not taking that time to sit and pause and be like, right, I pat myself on the back for like what I've done. It was just like right on to the next one. Yeah, and this again continued throughout into my first job, so where I am now. So I actually began in the company as a digital marketing assistant, and I haven't come from a marketing background at all. I'm an English literature student, creative arts student. So I didn't want to make any mistakes. I was very fearful of that. And the kind of overbearing kind of hanging thought of not wanting to let anyone down in the team was very intense, especially my manager. And I've also been recently quite guilty of procrastinating on a task, just kind of pondering on it as well, because I'm just fearful of, oh no, I don't want to make any mistakes. And it's so unhelpful. You end up just sitting there for ages, time on end. And yeah, so I guess all in all, I would say that unhealthy perfectionism for me has often brought on periods of anxiety. It's impacted my self-esteem and my confidence. I think in general, it just makes you forget that making mistakes is all part of learning. It can actually have a detrimental impact on your mental as well as physical health, I would say. So for in terms of mental health, I feel like if it's not addressed, or if it's left untreated, it could lead to poor mental health. And I think if it persists for a long time, it could bring on long-term anxiety, which can be very debilitating. And it's something that I suffer from personally. So I suffer from general anxiety disorder. And just having that alone and having to deal with unhealthy perfectionism on top of that, it's a lot. It's quite intense. And then, yeah, in terms of how it can, unhealthy perfectionism can affect physical health, I would say your body can just end up feeling very tense. I think, you're just, when you're in that state of, or displaying some perfectionistic behaviors, you're always trying to uphold that. And I just feel like your body's not relaxed. You're always very uptight. Always on edge. So I think it does have just the same side as kind of having an effect on mental health. It also has a side effect on physical health. But in terms of, I would say, how I challenge it, I think that's the most important thing, especially what we're talking about today. I would say that it has become a bit harder since I've been diagnosed with GAD. But I do try to remind myself that all I can do is try my best, and that my best is good enough. That's something, thankfully, that my mum has always said to me and kind of always instilled in me constantly. And also the idea of just challenging thoughts. It's something I constantly explore in CBT therapy. So that's cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what I'm doing now, just to kind of help with my anxiety. And I think although it may feel like making mistakes is the end of the world, you just have to constantly remind yourself that it isn't, and that no employer should make you feel like it is the end of the world either. If it does happen, if you do make a mistake, it essentially is all part of learning, and it's also part of your personal development. So I think essentially it's key. If you can't go through life without making any mistakes, because you wouldn't learn at the end of the day. But I also do engage in kind of holistic practices. So affirmations, which is essentially talking to yourself, which I know sounds really, really weird, but I'm a massive champion of it. So just speaking confidence into myself, just saying things like, like, I'm going to do well today, or I'm going to complete this piece of work today, and it may not be perfect, but I've done my best. And that just makes me feel a bit calmer. And just any types of kind of like mindfulness practices as well. So I do like yoga meditation, and that kind of helps in building my confidence, boosting my self-esteem, and essentially enhancing the idea of being in the present. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, and thank you for, so honestly sharing your experiences and kind of some of those interactions with our mental health and our physical health as well. I think that that's important to remember, that certainly when you ignore everything other than kind of, that drive for perfectionism, there are lots of negative consequences that we need to be aware of, and that can help us to challenge some of those behaviours. So I'm really delighted now to hand over to our third panellist, Wil Banks. Wil is an analyst at the Bank of England, having joined the Graduate Development Programme in 2020 after he completed his studies at the LSE. And Wil has also been a very brave advocate for mental health and has candidly shared some of his experiences about the challenges and stresses of that transition out of university into the Wild West that is the job market and eventually into employment. So Wil, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anastasia, and thanks to Farimah and Ashley. Listening to both of you speak, I was kind of doing a mental checklist, and basically everything that you said I agree with and relate to. So as Ashley mentioned, I think that unhealthy perfectionism is something that starts for a lot of people before we even come to university. It's kind of an issue that can originate when we're teenagers, and that we carry through with us. And I think the kind of process of starting a career can amplify a lot of it. And kind of encourage even unhealthier habits and kind of even more extreme forms of perfectionism. Listening to Farimah's kind of list of the different traits at the start, I kind of agree with all of them. But I think there are two things that particularly resonate with me. Firstly, being around high expectations that I set for myself, but also kind of the inability to celebrate any achievements that I do have, because I kind of think, right, that's what I expected of myself, I'm going to move on to the next thing. And I think for me, the story that illustrates that the best is my experience of applying to internships at university. So I came to university, I was at LSE, as Anastasia mentioned, which is kind of quite famously quite an intense environment. A lot of people go there with a focus on getting a really good career, whatever that might mean to them. That isn't why I went. I just really liked my course and thought it sounded quite fun and wanted to live in London. And so at the start of university, for me, I was actually very relaxed about starting a career. It wasn't something I thought about much, but as I spent a lot of time with people who were maybe more driven and more focused, I thought, okay, maybe I should apply to some internships. You know, it'd be nice to have a job for the summer. It might help me work out what I want to do. And that turned into a bit of a rabbit hole for me. So it started off quite healthy. I would send off a couple of applications and think, oh, it'd be fun to work there. The first being to the bank where I'm working now, and I just thought that sounds like a really cool job. But I found as I bounced off other people who were doing a similar thing, I got almost addicted to applying to internships. And what I found through that is that my idea of success was narrowing really, really quickly. So I would have said when I joined university, I would have defined success quite broadly, and it wouldn't have just been about my career, but also kind of having strong relationships, having hobbies that I enjoyed, and as someone with a really long-term diagnosis of depression, being able to manage that for me was part of my idea of success. But I found that kind of getting on the corporate ladder, if you will, and starting to think about careers really blinkered me. And I started to define success as getting an internship. Basically, that was all the idea of success meant to me. And that was really unhealthy for me, because at the times where it looked like I wasn't going to get an internship, or if I received a rejection, and I think I received 20 rejections that year, I was applying a lot, it would make me feel that I was not destined to be successful, that there was no chance I'd be successful, and these rejections were proof of that. And I think it's taken me quite a long time since then to kind of re-broaden my sense of what it is to be successful. And it took me actually getting an internship at somewhere that I really valued to be able to kind of remember all of these other things that I do really care about, but kind of had forgotten. And then the next part of the story for me is when I was actually on one of these internships. So I was on an internship for 8 weeks, and I found that I had really bad imposter syndrome while I was there. So for those of you not familiar with that term, I kind of felt that I had got into the job by luck. I don't know, I thought maybe someone else had dropped out and that's why I got given the space, or kind of there was some reason that I'd kind of tricked people into thinking that I belonged to be there. And that's where the perfectionism really came in for me, in that I thought if I made a really small mistake, people would catch me out and find out that I had got in by luck and by chance and that I didn't deserve to be there. And so any bit of developmental feedback to me was criticism and was proof that I wasn't right for the job, that I didn't deserve to be there, and kind of what I had been saying to myself was true all along. There was something wrong with me and I kind of wasn't going to be successful. And to be honest, even though the internship went well and I've ended up kind of getting a job that I really want, these kind of symptoms haven't particularly gone away. I still find I need to remind myself, actually, you don't define success so narrowly. Remember all these other things about yourself that you really care about and really enjoy. and I still find getting feedback really difficult. So I'm 6 months into a permanent job now, and that's helped a bit, but I will notice very, very tiny mistakes that I've made, and I will sit, especially working from home, I will sit in my bedroom just thinking about that for hours and hours on end. And I think, I think the pandemic's definitely exacerbated that for me. I always try and end on a more positive note, which is a little bit tricky because, as I said, it's something that I'm still struggling with, definitely. But what I have found is that for me, my peer set has been the thing that's kind of saved me and made this manageable. So I'm in a group of around 60 other grads, and I talk about this a lot. People get fed up that I'm always banging on about mental health. And I think pretty much everyone I've spoken to about it directly goes through a really similar thing. As Farimah said, it's something which is kind of systemic and has been increasing in recent years. And I at least take some confidence in that it's not strange. It's not just me that feels like an outsider. It's not just me that gets imposter syndrome and struggles with that. And taking some solace in that at least gives me the power to remind myself, kind of as Ashley mentioned, you know, you're doing well, you can do this, you can get through each individual day, and you're not the only one struggling. So yeah, that's my piece.
Thank you so much. Again, you know, similarly, thank you for your honesty. I think really interesting connection there between imposter syndrome and unhealthy perfectionism. And I saw lots of emphatic nodding from myself and from Ashley. So I think that certainly lots of what you were saying was resonating with us, and I'm sure with audience members as well. So thank you very much for sharing that. So I'm going to move on to a couple of questions that I've prepared for our panelists before we then open up to audience Q&A. So audience members, this is a good chance to have a think about whether you've got any questions for our panelists, and do pop them into the chat so that I can put them to the panelists just after this next section. So to kick off, Ashley, this is one for you. So you've spoken really honestly about the high expectations that you have of yourself and how that can be challenging to manage. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps kind of the impact that social media can have on the pressures that we put on ourselves?
Yeah, this is actually a topic that I speak about a lot with my friends. So I'm sure everyone is aware of the quote that says comparison is the thief of joy. And I think that very much ties in perfectly with unhealthy perfectionism. I think especially Instagram is probably the one that pops to mind right now when I think about unhealthy perfectionism. It's just that looking at other people and how they present themselves so perfectly. You know, Instagram is made and is there for perfect presentation of yourself. And it's just it's so unrealistic, but I think everyone can kind of get caught in the moment with it quite a lot. And I think it's something where I find it's really important to take some time out from social media. I think detoxes are so important. I think as I've got older, I've definitely understood more about the importance of those. But I think advice I would give is just kind of stay in your own lane and kind of have that kind of tunnel vision when it comes to carving out your own goals, whether that's personal or professional. Because it really does help. If you're, you know, fixated with everyone else, how are you going to do what you want to do? And that the main thing that you need to remember is it's about you. It's not about everyone else at this point. When you're thinking about your own goals and your own achievements. And just remember, yeah, I think social media also isn't completely real. And yeah, everyone is in their own way kind of winging it in life. No one's perfect. Yeah, those are the two things I probably remember.
Absolutely, thank you. Definitely, I think I'd agree with you that comparison piece is you know, often unhelpful, particularly when we're seeing things through a filter, when we see them on social media. Wil and Farimah, did you have anything that you wanted to add on the social media piece?
Yeah, just briefly, actually. I think that people have the ability, and it's not that easy, but to define how they use social media and their relationship with it. So I definitely relate to what Ashley was saying and kind of comparing to people's lives that look really perfect. So I, rather than detoxing, because I find, you know, if I'm not on Instagram, what am I doing? The way that I kind of reclaimed it for me was bringing some of my imperfection into my posts and the things that I shared. So I now speak a lot more about mental health. Everyone that follows me on Instagram will know that I've got depression and it's something that I really struggle with. And I think explicitly making my outward presentation less perfect helped me to put less pressure on myself.
Thank you.
I think it's all been covered from my point of view, Anastasia.
Perfect, thank you. And yeah, I think maybe some encouragement there for audience members to have a think about whether there are ways that they can sort of reclaim their kind of approach to social media as well. As Wil said, it's easier said than done, but I think that through kind of small behaviours, we can definitely try and kind of, you know, address that. So Wil, back to you for the next question. You know, I think organisations have increasingly tried to improve sort of the wellbeing services that they provide, and those packages of support are quite comprehensive for employees now. But you've spoken quite openly and candidly about your experiences before that, so through the recruitment stages, through those attraction stages. Do you think that there's something that employers can be doing to kind of address that toxic perfectionism in those stages before you get to the safety net of being able to access some of those supports?
I think definitely. As I mentioned, I applied to a lot of internships, and there were some departments that dealt with it really, really well and really helped me, and some application processes that definitely made things worse. So the first thing that I'd highlight is getting proportionate feedback on an application. So one thing that I think a lot of people might forget or might not realise is how long it takes to write an application. And all the extra stages, including kind of psychometric testing, verbal, non-verbal reasoning testing, etc., makes you quite mentally committed to getting that job, and it makes it more personal the more time that you've spent kind of doing the application. And I found that the places that I was drawn to, even if I were rejected from them, were the places that kind of thought, okay, well, you've given, I don't know, 5 hours of your time on this application, you deserve to clearly understand what we liked about your application and what we kind of thought you might be able to improve on. And it really helped me having at least some tips on, okay, if I were to do that again, this is what I could change. Whereas applications where you kind of send off a very long, like written answers, CV, cover letter, etc., and then just get a kind of template email. I've had emails that say, dear, insert name here, where they haven't even copied my name in properly. Those can make it a lot worse and feel like you're kind of pouring your soul out and putting a lot of effort into an application where the company actually doesn't particularly care about you. And then the other thing I would say is putting a bit more emphasis on luck. So a lot of kind of people in early careers that I talk to acknowledge that no application process is perfect and no company is actually choosing the perfect 60, 100, however many candidates every time. And so kind of acknowledging that there is a slight arbitrary nature to the applications process, and you might have been excellent, but just kind of not slipped through the net this time through no fault of your own. I think acknowledging and being upfront about that is really important. And then just the last thing I would say is that kind of working from home, things have got a little bit harder, and not being able to meet people face to face has made that harder. So I think companies should acknowledge that that kind of can make the application process even more difficult.
Thank you so much, and definitely hearing a lot of the importance of that human touch. I think that as we move to kind of rely more on technology, it can be easy to kind of lose the individual and the person and the effort that goes into something like a recruitment process. So thank you for sharing that. Ashley and Farimah, yes, over to you.
Well, I just wanted to add to that. I think that was I think the points that Wil made about the recruitment process are really important. I think the other thing, and this is natural, in a recruitment process, a company will say, we are the best. We hire the best. Everyone that works here is the best. So you think this place is perfect. So if you do get a job there, you've landed in a place that you think is the best. Or if you're not hired from there, you think that you've been rejected by someone because you're the best. But actually, the thing to remember is a lot of it is marketing language. There's a lot of people in that organization that have made mistakes, have failed professional exams, have been rejected from other companies. And look, they're all great people, but I think the recruitment process, their job is to market themselves. And so I think that lays out a perfect culture, whereas actually, maybe we need some extra language that lays out a growth culture. And we're looking for people that will fit us in this way, and we're looking to develop people. So there may be work that can be done around that. It's of course natural to say we're the best because they want to get as many applications as possible. I just think that's something else in the recruitment process that might be something that can be changed.
Absolutely. Ashley, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think both of them covered those really well. No.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you all for your inputs on that perspective. I think you know, I'm sure that kind of amongst our audience members, we do have those that are representative of employers and organisations, and perhaps kind of some things for them to think about with relation to that attraction and marketing piece and some of the language, because as we know, language is incredibly important. So final question from me before I hand over to some audience questions. It's for you, Farimah. So obviously you have a wealth of experience of working with various employers, and I think kind of within this group here we have a good awareness of, you know, the challenges of unhealthy perfectionism. From your experience, do you think that organisations get it? And if they don't, or if they don't sufficiently, what can we do to make them understand some of these difficulties?
I think more organisations, not all, but they are starting to understand it, and they are starting to understand that there is this kind of fear of failure and wanting to be perfect, but I think there's more education to be done, and the CMHA has done that in a number of ways. We've run events introducing this to wellbeing leads for our members. We do annual research, and last year we researched early careers job seekers, and 71% said they reacted to small mistakes with a huge amount of self-criticism. 60% said they work longer hours than they felt they should to get something absolutely perfect. So we try to bring the reality to businesses so they can see it. So yes, I think it is increasing. I think that where possible, I think that people who are at the start of their career, if they have an opportunity to feed this back to their to line managers or employers or HR via employee surveys or focus groups or feedback groups, which I know are increasingly prevalent, especially around the idea of well-being and how we can support your well-being. I do think mention it anonymously or otherwise, because this is a well-being issue, this is a mental health issue, this is a thriving at work issue. So I would urge people, if they feel it, to say, this is something that affects me. This is maybe, you know, don't have the solutions. I'm just telling you that this is a problem. And I think, but then what do they do with that awareness? So they need to be aware, but what do they do with it? And I as I said at the start, I think it is important that businesses should take action. And I've seen in some of the chat that there are kind of questions about what businesses could do. I think there is something around looking at language. It's very simple, but not where we're the best all the time, but that we celebrate growth and that mistakes are a part of learning. And look, if you walked into a business and were perfect, you'd just be promoted to CEO. Like, clearly there is a path of learning and mistakes that gets you to, I'm not saying everyone wants to be a CEO, but far from it, but there is a path that gets you as you move up seniority. And so, and I also think, and I wanted to talk about what Wil was saying, that it would be great if more leaders talked about their failures, their mistakes. You know, these successful executives who are sitting there looking like they got everything right. I was once in a room and this executive, it was a professional services company, talked about how he'd failed professional exams 3 times. Like, all the kind of people that start whizzed around and were like really surprised. Like, everyone fails and makes mistakes or doesn't get everything right first time. And I just think we need to be, as Wil's doing on social media, encouraged to talk about that growth culture, that actually failing or making a mistake, learning is part of. So it's just, what more can we do? And I don't have all the answers to encourage that growth culture. Another thing that CMHA has done is it's developed a kind of a 1-hour, training session over lunch for line managers of people in their early careers, for them to understand what are the mental health challenges facing those people at that time, because it might be different to when they were at the early careers. You kind of lean on your own experience, and I don't think the pressures facing people that start their career today, especially after the pandemic, is seismic. And so I think there needs to be maybe a bit of education and helping line managers to better understand the challenges, and that includes this unhealthy perfectionism as well. Bit of a rambling answer, Anastasia, but I hope that
No,
helps.
it was perfect, and a really great segue into the audience Q&A, which we'll move to next, because I think you sort of touched on the question from Hannah there, which was, what initiatives do you think companies could put into place to reduce unhealthy perfectionism? I'm going to open that up to Wil and Ashley. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what you think would be beneficial to see within organisations once people have joined, to kind of address some of that as well.
It's a difficult question, and I think I would say actually that a lot of the things that have helped me in my first 6 months haven't been to do with initiatives, but to do with my relationship with individual people. So I feel really lucky in the job that I'm in to have a great relationship with my line manager, and when I get a bit of feedback, he will always phone me and say, how do you feel about this feedback? Do you have any questions? Do you want anything clarifying? And at the end of my first big bit of work, there was one bit of feedback that said, kind of, this section of your work could maybe have been more accurate. And that kind of, as I've touched on before, I found really difficult to deal with. And what really helped me there was that he contextualized that bit of feedback and said, this isn't saying, oh, you're underperforming compared to the standards that we set for you. This bit of feedback is saying, we think you can do really well. We want you to develop a lot in your first 2 years here. And this is just one way that you might be able to do that. And kind of clarifying that feedback was nothing to do with kind of my performance on the job has really helped me kind of gain a bit more confidence and a bit more resilience in receiving it.
Thank you, Wil. And I think that, you know, if we've got some managers amongst the audience, that might be a piece of kind of, you know, feedback, so to speak, for them to take away, that I think contextualizing that feedback can really help someone who, you know, like many of us on this session, will take that feedback to kind of be reflections of us as you know, entire humans. Ashley, was there anything further that you wanted to say about that?
I pretty much, yeah, I agree a lot with Wil in terms of having that good, firm relationship with, you know, your manager, whoever is higher than you. And I think as well, it's communication. I think it really comes down to is how you communicate that feedback. And also, like, make sure there is just as much just kind of congratulation and praise for what you're doing well as there's also going to be feedback or kind of helpful criticism. Because I think when there's too much of the you know, the criticism and the feedback side, it can be quite overwhelming. I think there should be a good balance between praising and also giving you kind of critical feedback. Yeah.
Thank you. Farimah, I've seen you've unmuted. I don't know if it's because you
No, well, I mean, I'm happy to chat, obviously, but no, not for a particular reason.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that. I think that Ashley, that point speaks to, you know, what Farimah was mentioning about unhealthy perfectionism for many of us can look like being unable to celebrate those wins, and so sometimes that kind of positive feedback and that praise and that celebration can encourage us to have a think about how we actually reflect on and celebrate our achievements as well. I think from kind of the breadth of the conversation, we've touched on another question that we have from another Hannah, and also a similar one that we received privately, which was around how managers can help people to overcome unhealthy perfectionism. So, I mean, unless there are any further additions from panelists, I think that we've sort of covered this. So we'll move on to the next question. So we've got a question here from Nick Hooper, who's talking about the relationship between performance ratings and how we're graded on our performance and unhealthy perfectionism. So any tips, particularly from Ashley and Wil, yourselves, kind of from your experience of really kind of being in the heart of that at the start of your careers, how do you mitigate the mental health impact of some of the stresses that can come with performance ratings?
For me, I mean, personally, I've never been graded on my performance. I don't necessarily think that's even the best way to go about it at all. I probably quite disagree on that. I think grading can be quite degrading. So I would kind of, if you can, avoid putting on a scale of 1 to 10 of how well you're doing. I think it's more about having an actual proper conversation. And yeah, like we were saying, like picking out, being very specific about how you are performing rather than just giving you a number on it. But yeah, I think in terms of mitigating impact on mental health, I would say that I think the company needs to be mentally aware. I think that's something that I'm really pushing for in my company, and being the wellbeing lead, just pushing for mental health awareness training. And I think as well, doing things as a team, just having discussions with a team about how we can all do better as a company, rather than just putting all the pressure on, the one individual, because at the end of the day, you are all working together toward bettering the company and its goals of the company. So yeah, I'd say that.
So I have a slightly different experience to Ashley, in that kind of when I was on an internship, there was quite a clear grading system. And you knew that on the penultimate day of your internship, you would go into a meeting and be told what number you'd been given. And having that one number feel like it sums up their assessment of who you are as a person, I found really difficult. So I actually did quite well looking back on it, but at the time, because it wasn't kind of the highest number on the scale, I thought this was like a fatal bit of news, and they thought that I was awful and kind of thought very catastrophically about it. And the way that since then I've tried to kind of recontextualize that in my head is thinking about the fact that even the people giving the ratings know that it's slightly arbitrary. I don't think anyone would say that kind of a numerical rating is a perfect system that can kind of capture a whole person and their performance. And kind of realizing that at some point they do just have to make a choice and put you somewhere on the scale, whether that's kind of right at the very top or just like slightly shy of it. No one would expect that number to reflect the whole of who you are as a person or as an employee.
I would just add that I think the contextualization is important. If that is the way that performance management happens, it cannot just be that number. I would suggest that there needs to be context around it, and I'm sure there is, but context around it, but also the message about how this is part of a growth and this is where you can get to next, and it needs to be contextualized. I would also say that we know that a number of our members are looking at their performance management in the push to be mentally healthy workplaces. There's a review of performance management. It may be that grading is the right thing to do, but it may be that it comes with other pieces of work. So that mental health in the workplace is mental health first aiders are incredibly important, and support is incredibly important, but also just looking at work and environment design and things that put additional stress on you, and performance management does that. And again, performance management is important. It's super important for everyone involved and the individual. It's just doing it in a way that is as productive as possible of growth and supportive of growth. So yeah, I think context is everything as well.
Absolutely, and I think talking to that point, Hayley has commented in the chat a really good point around the importance of objectives. So, again, it's not just, it shouldn't be a number that comes out of nowhere, but if you know what you're working towards, and perhaps for those of us who suffer with, unhealthy perfectionism, some support in making sure that those objectives are realistic and attainable, and that you know how to get to them, rather than kind of setting the bar so high that, it becomes incredibly stressful to try and kind of address those. So I'm very conscious of time, because I know that for our audience members, you're all very busy yourselves, and of course our panelists are busy as well. So I think we're going to round it up there. I'm afraid we didn't get to a couple of the questions, but I think that we can pick up on some of those themes and share them with some after event comms. As we mentioned, the event has been recorded, so it's something that we'll be able to share with you, so that you can either pass on if you found some of the messaging useful today, or rewatch if there's anything that you wanted to revisit. So as we come to the close, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our fantastic panelists for their honesty and for such candid and important conversations on what I think is a really important topic that we keep opening up conversations about. So thank you for taking the time to speak today, and thank you to our audience members for taking the time as well to join us. I hope that it has been useful. I hope that it prompts some conversations, not just amongst you as audience members, but also to take away and share with your organisations, your peers, friends and family. And please do engage with Thriving from the Start events in the future. If you're not a member, you can sign up to our newsletter so that we can keep you in the loop. And I've just popped the link to subscribe in the chat there. But thank you all very much.